I'm Susan Flory, and this is The Big Middle, a podcast about all things midlife, being healthy older for much longer in a world fixated on youth. One day, that diagram of the traditional food pyramid will be in museums recording the histories of human genocides. It was on Twitter that my guest called conventional dietary guidelines little to no fat, heavy on the carbs, akin to genocide. But he's no crackpot food faddist. The tweet that horrified some was from Professor Tim Noakes, esteemed South African sports scientist, tireless advocate of a low-carb, high-fat lifestyle. Now, we're in a cafe in your gorgeous hometown of Cape Town. Professor, do people put down the bread and the muffin when they see you're at the table just beside them?
They try to hide it, but they always look at what I'm eating and they try desperately to catch me out. But unfortunately they won't, because I simply don't eat those foods.
Now, the tweet, it was from a while ago, but I thought it was particularly pertinent to our topic. It isn't your only controversial one, Professor. I invite anyone who doesn't know your history to click around and discover it now. But it's the starting point that I've chosen. How is the conventional eating advice that us midlifers, us over 50s, have had pretty much all our lives, a form of genocide?
Well, it caused the greatest plague in history of medicine, and that is the obesity diabetes epidemic, which begins in the 1980s. The obesity crisis begins in the 1980s, which is 3 years after the dietary guidelines are introduced. And the diabetes epidemic begins predictably 20 years thereafter, because once you start feeding people who are insulin resistant a high carbohydrate diet, it takes 20 years for them to develop diabetes. Now, diabetes is now the biggest disease in the world.
It's not type 1 we're talking about. We're talking about the old adult onset or type 2 diabetes, but it can no longer be called adult onset because kids are getting it.
Correct. The youngest child to get one is age 3 years. There are legions of children under 10 who have type 2 diabetes.
So what led you 8 years ago to delve into the science and start following low-carb, high-fat eating?
It was a complete chance. And in fact, it happened right here where we are. I was running and there's a little hill just behind us. And when I reached the top of that hill, I just felt terrible and I thought I was about to die. And I went home and opened my emails, and there fortunately was an advert for the book called The New Atkins for the New You. And I opened it and I saw that the 3 scientists involved were really good scientists, and I knew them well. And I said, how could they possibly be involved with Atkins? Because Atkins was the guy who tried to kill us all by telling us to eat saturated fat.
Mainstream medicine said, oh, he's a kook.
Absolutely. And for 33 years, I'd been fed that story because I trained in the cardiology unit at University of Cape Town. My professor was Professor Lionel Opie, was the leading cardiac scientist in South Africa and one of the few who was recognized South Africans in the world in his field. And he told me, that the saturated fat's going to kill me. So
Did he try to put you on statins?
So that was before the statins. That was the 70s. So my whole adult life, I was on this low-fat diet. And I just got fatter. And it turns out I developed type 2 diabetes, which on that day I didn't know. Anyway, I got so angry that I decided I better buy this book, The New Atkins for the New You. And I read it. And within 2 hours, I said, oh, my gosh, I got it all wrong. I didn't know there was so much evidence that a low-carbohydrate diet is beneficial. And there was all the science. They had 150 scientific papers. And I knew nothing about it. It had been completely hidden from me, as it is hidden from all medical students around the globe. They just told that there's no such evidence. So I decided I would start that within hours I would start. So my lunch was a low carbohydrate lunch. And I decided I'm going to kick carbs. And the benefits were so huge for me that I realized this is the way I should have been all my life.
And were they immediate, the benefits?
Well, almost immediate, because I was clearly type 2 diabetic then, although I only made the diagnosis some months later. And so if you take a diabetic who's got glucose up in the sky, as I realized mine must have been at that time, and just cut the carbs, then the glucose is going to stabilize and you'll start to feel better immediately.
Rhinitis disappeared, you didn't snore anymore, you slept more soundly, sharper cognition.
That was amazing. It was, and all these gut reflex or the gastrointestinal reflux that I was having, that also disappeared.
And you were on your way to almost surgery for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how long did it take to reverse that?
Within 3 weeks, I noticed suddenly I wasn't getting any of this reflux.
But did you cut sugar and carbs? There was no garbage at all in your diet?
I cut carbs initially, but I probably cut to 100 grams a day. Initially, I'm down to 25 or less now, but I was still taking sugar because I couldn't get off it. I mean, I was such a sugar addict.
In what form? A date or two a day? Or
No, it was typically drinks, cool drinks.
Okay.
Because I'd run all my life, and you run and when you finish, water's not going to be good enough. You've got to have your sugar in it.
And you want your electrolytes and...
Yeah, all that nonsense. So I had to get my sugar high, and it took me 14 months to get off the sugar.
So 8 years on it, and you're feeling what?
Amazing. I mean, I've just come from gym, as you can see, and the workout was really tough. And here I'm 68, and
he's doing CrossFit, by the way. That burpees, lifts, lunges.
Yeah, and it's high intensity stuff too. So I'm feeling fantastic. But let's take the contrast. You see, let's say 7 years ago I hadn't gone on this diet. I would have been on insulin now. I'm 82 kilograms, 81, 82 kilograms at the moment. I was 101 before I started, so I've dropped to 82, 81. And if I was now on insulin, I'd be 120 kilograms, and I'd have the complications. I'd have starting complications for type 2 diabetes. Because I must make the point that my dad was diagnosed type 2 diabetic and died 10 years later. And I know I've been diabetic for at least 10 years, but probably at least I know for 7 years I've been diabetic.
Had you not had blood tests done
No,
in
I
the
did,
10 years?
But I only had my fasting glucose, which was still okay, which doesn't mean you're not diabetic.
And did you have fasting insulin? Were you quite insulin resistant?
Exactly right. I think I tipped, and I didn't. I think I just tipped shortly before I converted. But of course, I'd been pre-diabetic for I can tell you for how long, for more than 30 years, because I went back and looked at some of my data from myself when we were doing trials on myself and other people on low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate diets in 1978. And I had a fasting insulin 4 times normal.
Wow. Doctors didn't tweak to that.
It didn't mean anything in those days, Well, it's just, you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you can have a high insulin. Yeah.
And no worries.
And I was running 140 kilometers a week, and I was lean. I was probably 79, 80 kilos then, so I wasn't...
Wow. I completely get why that happens, because you and I'm a teensy bit younger than you, not much, and same story. This is part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast, The Big Middle, because we need help. There's so much conflicting advice out there about diet and how to live longer well. I am a prime example of a broken metabolism. I mean, as a kid, as a teenager, we used to starve ourselves. We swallowed whole that calories in, calories out, eat less, move more dogma. And we were so abstemious with food, egg whites and cardboard rice cakes and butter, never. And yet we all ended up, being a little bit chubby or having more weight than we would have liked. Yeah. So what is the secret? You call it Banting, hugely popular here in South Africa. It seems to be about the same as the ketogenic regimen that I'm following now. What's the difference, and what are the key drivers for all of that?
I think they're all the same. And you take Atkins as well. People say, is there any difference with Atkins? No. Atkins said you must cut carbohydrates to below 60 grams, and that's fine. I think you need to go a bit lower if you've got type 2 diabetes. You see, the key that no one ever told you is that hunger is what makes us fat. And if you can't control your hunger, you will never be thin. And you kindly gave me an outline of what you were eating at some time in your life. And it's all nutrient-poor foods, plant-based mainly, with a little bit of odd bit of fish here and there.
Well, I was counting calories.
Yeah.
I was wearing it as a badge of honor.
Right.
And watching my arms, especially at menopause, get thicker, my thighs get thicker, and back fat, hello? And, going to the gym and doing these high-intensity aerobics and just going, wait, I am doing everything that these experts say, and yet anyone who looked at the food log, and most of the people that are our age, would follow the same thing.
Exactly.
It's a big bowl of mixed greens and some peppers and a little bit of fish and just count those calories. And if you can keep it to 800 to 1,000, the weight should just fall off you. But it doesn't. You're hungry all the time.
You're hungry all the time. That's correct. So, and then when you convert to this, as soon as you cut sugar and carbohydrates, you lose your hunger, as you know. And that's the key. And I couldn't believe it, because when I read that first advert, it said lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks on the Atkins diet. And I said, well, of course that's rubbish. We know that. The only way you can lose weight is to starve and get hungry. And I mean, we'd all tried it. I'd tried it myself plenty of times. And it never worked for any length of time.
And the satiety, the hunger killer is the fat.
Yeah.
Welcome fat in your life, good fats,
Yeah.
and you'll be fine. You won't be hungry, as you and I can attest.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to do it. So, my wife, I used to not eat breakfast. I used to starve myself all day. I'm only repeating what you know.
I'm putting my hand up. Yeah,
and then
me
I would
too.
come home, and I'd come home at, let's say, 5 o'clock, and my wife would have dinner prepared for 6. But between 5 and 6, I would already eat twice the dinner.
3 bags of nachos and...
Exactly, and bread and peanut butter and margarine and jelly sort of things. And that's what I would eat. And she would say, but can't you wait for dinner? And I couldn't.
And you were craving any food, but mostly the carbs and the sugar.
Exactly right.
Which then drives up your insulin.
Yeah.
And insulin is what makes you fat, would you say?
Well, I was advised early on that I'd done the right thing, that focus on type 2 diabetes and this diet, because there's no doubt that this diet is the treatment for type 2 diabetes. But stay away from obesity, because it's actually quite difficult to prove that insulin is the driver of obesity. And I believe it is, but the evidence isn't there yet. But whereas the evidence is absolutely firm that insulin and type 2 diabetes and carbohydrates are all linked, and a low carbohydrate diet's the treatment. So I stray away from saying that insulin is the direct cause of obesity, but I think it is. But I don't want to get dragged down.
Well, for people who are carb intolerant like you and I, it is.
Yeah.
But for people like a friend of mine who's whippet thin and just she needs food every 5 minutes. And she's okay on it. Glowing skin, glowing this. She's not me.
Yeah.
I'm that type. A lot of people listening will go into the grocery store, you look at food, anything, and it's on your hips.
Yeah, no, precisely. What we do know about insulin is that type 1 diabetics do not put on weight unless they inject the insulin. So it's pretty good evidence that insulin is the driver. And we know its main effect is to switch off fat metabolism and switch on carbohydrate metabolism. So the whole goal of the low-carb diet is to make you a fat burner. Yeah. And that's the beauty. So I did my workout, no breakfast, maybe a cup of coffee this morning before the workout, and now I'm having some more coffee and water.
2 things. One, we can talk about intermittent fasting and the role there, because that's what you're doing, isn't it? It's a daily intermittent fast, really. But I noticed in one of the articles I read in preparation to talk with you that you were saying that belly fat, you called it an insulin roll.
That's right.
Please tell me about that.
Well, that's one of my slides, shows how insulin drives fat into the fat cells and prevents it coming out. And so I said that people, when you look at the mirror in the morning, and you must look at your tummy and grab the insulin roll and you say, good morning, insulin roll. And then you get the connection. Okay, so what's causing insulin? Oh, it's carbohydrates. Okay, this roll.
Even if you're mirror avoidant.
That's right. So it was funny, I was on a television show on Saturday morning, and the guy, who's quite a good athlete, in fact, he's a bit younger than me and runs a bit faster, so he said, would you call me fat? You see, so I said, no, but you've got an insulin roll.
Put down the chips, you're not having wine with me, and forget the beer.
That's right. Well, bananas is his great weakness.
Oh, yeah.
And wine, of course. Yeah.
I mean, there's sugar shock.
Sugar is the real one.
Yeah.
A lot of the people, I'm beginning to realize that sugar is the driver of obesity, because it's so addictive.
But I was almost a fruitarian. I was a little bit, I was saying, my diet wasn't nutrition poor. I thought it was quite nutrient dense, but in all the wrong ways, because I would have loads of fruit, and I would think I was, again, being the queen of good eating.
Fruit is just candy. It's just a natural candy. And what interests me is when you look at dietitians' websites, all you see is fruit and vegetables. That's when they want to advertise a healthy diet, it's all fruit and vegetables. There's no dairy, there are no nuts, there's no meat, there's no fish.
Well, nuts, we were just never going near nuts. Because what a Brazil nut has, what do you learn?
Yeah, exactly.
100 calories, so just have the one. And
no,
it's madness.
So wrong. And that's coming back to the genocide story. That's the reality. We brought up billions of people across the world eating the diet that's killing them. And you know what frustrates me is I was born in 1949, so I matriculated in 1966, and everyone was lean. I tweeted the other day, there was a picture of the Beatles arriving in somewhere, I think in America, 1968. Everyone was lean. So I said, where are all the fatties? Question mark. I said, I forgot it's 1968 and the dietary guidelines occur in 1977. But I'm shocked because, literally every day I go out, people are fatter than they were the day before.
But when I went to a hospital in London and, I'd gone trying to figure out where does my body fat come from? Because my sister is lean, my parents were lean, everybody pretty much in the family is leaner than I am. And I thought, I'm so chunky. How's that possible? Hourglass chunky, but still chunky. And I went to a dietitian, and honestly, she looked like a little Buddha sitting behind her desk. She said, well, you should do what I do. And I get up and have a big bowl of cereal in the morning with some fruit on it, which is good for you. And I thought, already, that's too much sugar. I knew enough about that, too much garbage. And then she said, and then I have a big baked potato at lunch with beans, baked beans and cheese all over it. And then at night, I always have pasta. And I just, now I know. That's why she was the roly-poly. But for someone who wasn't doing so much of that and is still putting it on, I know now I'm insulin resistant. I'm carb intolerant, and that's circling back now to the intermittent fasting as being the key. So not spiking your insulin, that you think is vital.
Yeah, indeed. Getting back to the British Dietetics Association, it's headed up, it's basically a front for veganism and vegetarianism. So that's what, that we didn't know that, but now it is. And the head lady, she was on television once, and she was sounding off about how saturated fat definitely causes heart disease, despite the fact that we now know it doesn't. And so I tweeted and I shouldn't have done it.
Stir.
And I said, when she loses weight, I'll believe her. And she's grossly obese. And how can you, I still don't understand. How can you go to a dietitian who's fat and then take her advice? When I was fat, and I was overweight, I was never clinically obese. And in my books, I never wrote about obesity because I didn't understand it. I hadn't a clue. I tried to research it. And I couldn't make head or tail of it. I read all the science, and there was something missing. And the day that I went on the low-carb diet and lost my hunger, then I knew, that's it. It's hunger. Hunger's the issue, and hunger's never addressed.
Constantly searching for more carbs is what drives our need to have more and more and more and more.
Exactly.
So let's look at, hopefully, the audience for the big middle. Menopausal, postmenopausal, men going through andropause, suddenly having that beer belly. Tomorrow, what do? They follow your example, and mine too, and just stop eating the carbs.
Yeah, that's
the
key.
sugar.
The sugar, yeah. So the things to do is to get rid of I just decided to cut out the pasta, the rice, and the bread, and the potatoes. And I went carnivorous, and because I love meat. I've always loved meat. I was brought up by a mother from England whose father was in the meat industry in Liverpool. So she brought me up on meat and on offal. We used to have offal for breakfast. And then when I went to medical school and became clever, then I started doing what the dietitian told you we should do.
Well, it's hard to resist, isn't it? It's like a tsunami of advice that's all bad for you.
And I put on weight, and my running went downhill immediately.
You were always hungry and angry.
Exactly. And what I learned is I eat a very, very restricted range of foods now. And that's what keeps me healthy.
But do you eat good vegetables, above-ground vegetables?
Yeah. I prefer the high-protein, high-fat animal produce.
But
that's
moderate amounts? You're not eating a porterhouse steak all by yourself?
I eat very little.
Do you?
I eat one meal a day. I sit down and have one meal a day.
Nutrient dense. You'll have some vegetables on your plate. What would you have? Kale and some of the other above ground vegetables?
Yeah, but again, I thought that you had to have lots of vegetables, but the more I read, the less convinced I am that you have to have a lot of vegetables. And there's a whole zero carb movement and completely carnivorous movement.
So you're moving toward that, it sounds like.
Yeah, probably. But I probably have always been more that way. Yeah.
Because keto, what I've been looking at the science for, ketogenic eating, is low carb, high fat, moderate protein. So I'm always thinking, that's a very large piece of meat. I'll just have half now, half later. And then I will try to get my 20, 25 grams of carbs in good vegetables and only berries for food in my double cream Greek, lots of bacteria yogurt.
See, what you have to understand is that vegetables have only been in the human diet for 10,000 years maximum. And certainly most of the fruits were never around. And the potatoes, if you look back 100 years, the potatoes were tiny little things. And now they become these huge things full of sugar and full of carbohydrate. So that's completely changed. And point one. And point two is that plants are not meant to be eaten. They have to resist being eaten to survive. So they've got all these anti-nutrients in them. And many people get sick and get autoimmune diseases, in my opinion.
But not all plants.
Well, they all contain stuff, and that's why you have to cook them, and why you have to ferment the beans and so on if you're going to eat them.
But what about, that word, fiber? What about gut motility, all of that?
Fiber is the biggest garbage story. It's the other big garbage story in medicine. There's been one clinical trial, and people with constipation, they were taken off fiber, and it cured their constipation. The idea, what fiber does is it retains water, and it causes a swelling effect, and it's irritant. And you can tell that because if you've got big stools, they're always mucus. And the mucus is excreted because the gut's not happy with what's happening. Whereas when you become carnivorous, and look at the lions, you'll see that their stools are not mucousy. Or your cat. They pass these very dry stools. And that's the way it should be.
And that's why you get the cats off of this dry kibble as well, because that's pure carbs.
Absolutely.
All righty.
So fiber is completely, it was Kellogg's, it was the Seventh-day Adventists, and it's continued today because the dietetics associations globally are funded by the sugar industry and the cereal grain industry, including Kellogg's. And they have to say eat cereals and grains.
Yeah.
And that's why they have to say a plant-based diet, because as soon as you say a meat-based diet, then what do you cut? You cut cereals and grains. So they're out of business.
Yeah, and it's big pharma, big medicine. It's all that web, everyone together, giving us all of this bad information. And we can mention Ansel Keys, and people can maybe Google around on that, because we could have a whole show about just how that all happened, 1977, all the rest, and why it happened. I want to talk hormones. Ghrelin, leptin, cortisol, the importance of balancing these, and balancing them not just with, mindfulness and all the rest, and exercise, CrossFit, all of that. Proper sleep, because I'm still finding a lot of people who actually boast about not needing more than 5 hours a night. Sleep, it's for the fat, the lazy. You've got to get up and you've got to, bike for 100K, and never mind the sleep. And I, these dynamos of the universe, I would really like to say, no, you need 8 hours. Do you agree?
Yeah, circadian rhythms are terribly important, and they're beginning to realize that insulin resistance either causes abnormal circadian rhythms or abnormalities in circadian rhythms cause insulin resistance. So I think you're quite correct. You have to go to bed and you have to sleep properly, and people should be judging the quality of their sleep and monitoring it, and always sleeping a consistent number of hours a night. And for some people, it's generally between 7 and 9. But interestingly, once you go beyond 9, your health is worse, again, because probably the circadian rhythms are affected. And for most people, if it's less than 6 or 7, it's also not good.
Now, new science suggests, we've already touched on it a bit, but that our gut is linked to every major function in our bodies, from hormone levels to state of mind. First steps to repair gut damage, are we back to the two things you said? Cut the garbage, cut the sugar.
Yeah, I think so. Our problem at the moment is we don't know what the ideal gut flora is. And anyone who tells you they do is wrong, because there are trillions of bacteria, and I don't know how many different types of bacteria. And I asked someone who produces probiotics about that. He said, you cannot take a sample of stool and tell me that you've analyzed everything, because even in the pipetting, there are so many bacteria present. With a tiny error in pipetting, you're going to get the wrong concentrations. So what you find is that people interpret the gut flora according to what they believe. So if I'm a plant-based diet expert, I will go and take a vegetarian stool and say, you see, this is what you should be. These are the bacteria you should have. If I'm a paleo guy, I'll go and study paleo people and say, this is the bacteria that you should have.
But we don't know.
So we don't know. But I was really funny because someone went to examine the Hadza in Ethiopia and came back and said, they proved Noakes is right. So this was in The Guardian. And his own gut bacteria had changed within a few days of working with the Hadza. So he said, but he was a paleo guy, you see, so he would obviously interpret it as being positive.
He was already on side.
He was on side.
Right.
But it got a headline, and I thought that was... But it shows we all have our biases.
Yeah. There's no baseline for all of us. I was a fat baby.
Yeah.
And they put me on skim milk.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it started then.
Absolutely.
My issues.
Yeah. Well, you know, why were you fat? Because your mother was insulin resistant, and she probably had more carbohydrates in her diet.
She fit in your back pocket, though.
And would she?
No, she was 100 pounds dripping
But
wet.
then she could still be insulin resistant.
She was Irish.
Yeah.
I'm sure potatoes figured
Yeah.
large.
And then you were exposed to high glucose diet, and then you oversecreted insulin as a baby.
Well, fruit and veggies. I grew up on that.
Yeah,
Modest amounts of meat. We had the barbecues, but certainly not on the scale of the South African
Yeah,
braai.
yeah, that's right.
I mean, here is it the meat capital of the world?
Hong Kong is the
Is
best.
it?
And they have the longest lived people. So that's, of course, throwing out all the blue zones. You see that you're meant to eat the Mediterranean
What
diet.
about the rice
Yeah.
in Hong Kong?
Well, I don't think so, because they eat so much meat. It's the highest meat-eating population in the world.
So it nullifies or at least brings down the insulin spike?
Yeah, exactly. And well, you wouldn't eat much rice if you were eating meat as your primary source of calories.
So, and again, we get back to your central point that the diet that works for you is the one that takes away your hunger.
Yeah,
And the one that takes away your hunger,
exactly. Then it turns all your metabolism right. Then you start burning your stored fat. That's the key.
but to burn my stored fat, like let's say
Yeah.
I've been doing it, but I'm hands up. I've been living in Cape Town. The Pinotage is amazing. The Pinot Noir, everything's fantastic. Braai. And there are all those little extras at the braai. So you end up having more carbs than you might if you were preparing everything yourself. Tomorrow, if I want to reverse all of the abuse I've done to myself as a postmenopausal woman, I really have to do hardcore, cut the carbs and the sugar. For how long to get into this fat-burning phase?
Oh, a few days, but the benefits you'll start to become apparent after 2 or 3 weeks. And after 6 weeks, you'll really notice it.
Will I be sharper?
Yeah, you will. But you see, the problem is because you were trained in a particular thinking, you still hold on to some of the damage, like the vegetables and the fruits. And I think that you need to eat the simplest possible diet that gives you the answers you want. Yeah.
And for you, more and more, it's going zero carbs.
Yeah,
no fruit, no veg.
absolutely, yeah,
Big
yeah.
porterhouse for me, thanks.
Yeah, that's right.
Is it the size of the plate?
The point is that I will eat that and then I won't eat for 24 hours. So
Right.
it depends. But if it's a small one, I'll eat in 12 hours' time.
But what you're saying too, though, is again what's now popularly known. It's growing in popularity as well. Intermittent fasting. So dinner and then not eating till a late lunch.
Yeah, that I think is the best plan. So you eat at dinner and then you eat the next meal is lunchtime.
So it's all about not having an insulin spike. So not constantly putting glucose into your blood.
That's correct. And so for us with type 2 diabetes, the key is to get the insulin down. We never get the glucose down as much as we'd like. It's still a bit elevated, particularly in the mornings. But your insulin, as long as your insulin's low, then that's fine.
And do you think for someone like me, when I went through the menopause, I couldn't figure it out because here I'm having my blueberries and my yogurt and my big heaving bowls of lettuce and my salmon and all the rest, and looking at the calorie count because I was still completely brainwashed, calories in, calories out. And I was doing CrossFit, I was doing a lot of exercise, but starving all the time
that's right.
on nothing and storing, as you say, living proof, having back fat, having this, but also the menopause.
Yeah.
Progesterone, estrogen levels diving off a cliff. And then you also...
And I think those hormones act in the brain as well because they make you more hungry or something like that. I suspect that they make you more likely to be stimulated by carbohydrates to eat more. And it's like alcohol. Alcohol, I think, acts in the brain as well to make you more hungry.
It hits our pleasure centers.
Yeah, exactly.
Serotonin.
So you want to eat more food. Yeah.
But also what happened for me during menopause was my thyroid clapped out. And, I'm still dealing with that. And I've just gone off my natural desiccated thyroid, my thyroid medication. I can see within the last 2 months I'm chunkier, I've puffed out, my face looks puffier. All of that happens. But if I continue to eat this low-carb, high-fat way, and judging by what you're telling me, go easier on the vegetables, leave them aside a little bit more, do you think that will regularize these hormones?
Well, I can't say it will, but there are so many good examples of people who do recover from this condition by eating this diet. And I think it's because they eat more fat. And then you take away the autoimmune responses, which are, in my view, linked particularly to cereals and grains, but perhaps to other components of vegetables. So cereals and grains must go because we're just not really designed to eat them. And that, to me, as we discussed earlier, that was what really made a huge difference to my health.
And the fruit, which is pure sugar.
Yeah. And
Well,
the fruit
lots of
acts
fruit,
on
but
the
you can have a few
diabetes.
berries.
Yeah. The cereals and grains acts on this, what we call non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So many of us are sensitive to gluten, but we don't get celiac disease. And the medical profession basically only recognizes celiac disease as a part of gluten intolerance.
It's like my GP in London, she just said, oh, well, I don't know if that's going to help. And I cut gluten out because I had learned from being my own advocate with Hashimoto's, which is autoimmune thyroiditis, and it happened during menopause. I learned that that was the way to get the antibodies down, and they are down.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're still attacking my thyroid because I haven't had an ultrasound, and I really don't want to worry too much about it, but I'm really enjoying the satiety that I get, the lack of cravings, the lack of hunger from following low-carb, high-fat, moderate protein.
Correct. Then a lot of people will say exactly what you have said.
You've also said you can't outrun a bad diet.
Yeah.
I've read that notwithstanding those with metabolic damage, that food is 95% of the equation, not more, the fitness equation. Exercise only 5%. But can you qualify that? Can you tack on the buts that everyone's going to go?
When you look at all the evidence, there's hard scientific evidence that when you add exercise, it makes no difference, and that the dietary outcomes, if you were to do a one-year intervention and try to get people to lose weight, and you weren't to address the diet, you just exercised, the average weight loss will be about 1 kilogram after a full year. Well, I lost 1.5 kilograms in my first week on this diet, and I lost 11 kilograms in 8 weeks. And now that tells me that this is a real phenomenon.
If you're insulin resistant, this is the way to go.
Exactly right. So that's the evidence. The evidence is absolutely there. The trouble is that there's a whole industry. This fitness industry is based on the fact that you must burn more calories, and they're not about to let that go. So we were highly criticized. By the way, that article we wrote, You Can't Outrun a Bad Diet, with my colleague, Dr. Asim Malhotra, he was the first author, published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It was ranked 147th most read article in 2015 of 7 million scientific articles. 147th most read article.
And yet mainstream doctors are still dishing the conventional dietary guidelines.
But the people loved it. It was on the front of the newspapers around the globe.
Well, is that just people resistant to exercise, loving the fact that, oh, have the donut? So they weren't taking the rest of your message. They were just saying, oh, I'm not taking the spinning class because it's only 5%. But it's the mental benefit you get, isn't it? When you exercise, you've just come from CrossFit, you're glowing. And I have done nothing but prepare for this interview this morning, and I would have loved to do an aqua aerobics class or maybe do some weightlifting. When you do exercise, you get the serotonin lift.
There's huge physical benefits, but your weight's not going to be the factor. Yeah.
But you're building muscle, which is all to the good, isn't it?
That's right.
And if you want to help reverse fatty liver, oxygenating your blood cells, all of that.
You won't do it with exercise.
Okay, so fatty liver, we haven't touched on that one. Is that insulin fed?
It's insulin and high carbohydrate diets. And that then leads to all the complications of insulin resistance arise from the fatty liver. And so that's the one thing we have to prevent.
You've spent recent years being prosecuted and persecuted for your views, for challenging the orthodoxy on nutrition. You triumphed when you clashed in court with mainstream medical and dietetic professionals here in South Africa for promoting your views. Do you feel the tide is finally turning against the low-fat, high-carb status quo?
I think in the public it definitely is. In Cape Town we have a Facebook page called the Banting 7-Day Meal Plan Facebook page. It has 1.1 million members. It started 3 years ago. It increases by 2,000 a day.
What?
Yes, that's how Banting diet's gone viral in South Africa.
But this is drawing a global readership. This is certainly not just South Africa.
This is mainly South African, and the majority are Zulu or Xhosa-speaking South Africans.
Really?
And that's really exciting.
Oh, wow.
Because I don't think that they've been brainwashed the way the English speaker, the rest of us, have been brainwashed.
So if you say something that's not nonsensical, they go, oh, that makes sense, I'll do that.
And but they also notice their colleagues are getting thin.
Yeah.
I mean, every day. I mean, in fact, we just go to the restaurant next door. I'm the global hero because they're all on the Banting Facebook page.
Oh, fantastic.
So whenever I come, they have, can I have your picture with you, you see?
When we look at these guidelines, the international guidelines that are being dished by in the West, throughout the West, by all of the professionals and Big Pharma and Big Agro.
Right.
And we see in African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, everyone's fat now.
Yeah. And I think the public have accepted it, and the doctors unfortunately can't, because that's why they took me out, or they tried to take me out. There was a warning to any doctor, don't ever strain to get out of line. And that's why we call it the omerta. The profession has a code of silence.
So everything's closing ranks.
Yeah. And then, I didn't know about this, but postmodernism, I didn't understand what in the world postmodernism is. But it's an outgrowth of Marxism. When Marxism went under, because it clearly didn't work, the universities, all these people who'd been Marxists at the universities suddenly said, well, what are we going to do? And so then the oppressed and the oppressor. So that anyone who is in this country, white, male, heterosexual, is an oppressor. So whatever you say is wrong. So what I say is wrong, not because of the group that I come from. So promoting this diet is wrong because I'm oppressing, I don't know who, but I'm obviously the oppressor. And
well, that's going very deep.
Yeah, but it's very obvious, because in my trial, the opposition produced one scientific paper, which we prove is probably fraudulent. And it was manipulated to be fraudulent, but that is before the universities. We've complained to them.
You've written a book about this, looking at that 3-year battle. It's called
Law of Nutrition.
All right, and everyone can look at how that's all interconnected. And do you mention postmodernism in that as well?
No, because I didn't realize it until I read a Canadian by the name of Jordan B. Peterson. And then someone tweeted on my line and said, you must stand up for truth, because truth's the only thing that matters. And Peterson gives this impassioned speech, and he says, you either stand up for truth or you're nothing, because you're always you're defending nothing. You have to stand up for the truth. I did.
The only thing I can say now is, ain't that the truth? Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Professor Tim Noakes, celebrated sports scientist, controversial campaigner for eating low-carb, high-fat. Find out more at thenoakesfoundation.org, and in the next edition of The Big Middle, we're going to keep talking to the professor. We're going to get the low-carb, high-fat lifestyle fundamentals down in greater detail. Relevant information, inspirational interviews about midlife every other week on The Big Middle with me, Susan Flory. We'll see you next time.